in Jamaica. Consider, for example, the Jamaican names for two mixed race categories, China Royal and Coolie Royal. The Dictionary of Jamaican English defines China Royal as, quote, the offspring of a Chinese and usually a Negro or sometimes a white or East Indian, unquote. Similarly, the category Coolie Royal is defined as, quote, a person of mixed East Indian and Negro stock, unquote. The unnamed African appears to be the royal in both hybrids. But this is no necessary cause for celebration. A more cynical reading suggests that it is only in admixture that the royalty of African stock can be recognized. Or worse, royal neutrally signifies admixture and is thus a valorization of the mixed race ideal of Caribbean acculturation in which pure African stock is devalued. And indeed, the African majority in Jamaica has been subjected to a fictive definition of national identity that is essentially multiracial, and this is a problem we have throughout the region. This national myth is inscribed in the national motto, out of many, one people. The homogenizing impulse effectively invalidates the common sense claim that on the face of it, Jamaica very much looks like an African society. The mixed race motto does speak to the economic imbalance in the society that concentrates wealth in the hands of a few who are mostly the out of many one type, that is, not African. I will never forget the way in which the contradictions encoded in the motto were derided by one of my high school English teachers, an Englishwoman who could clearly see the self-deception enshrined in the motto. Out of many one people, which one? Furthermore, in Jamaican society, the discourse of race is usually articulated only in reference to black people. Other people are not raced in quite the same way. In a witty newspaper article entitled Perkins and Black History, Eric Mako McNeish, editor of the Jamaica Beat newspaper, gives a wicked anecdote to illustrate the way in which some Jamaicans refuse to acknowledge race as a marker of their own identity, but they can see it in others. Mako reports that, quote, when Chinese Jamaicans and East Indian Jamaicans used to organize annual cricket matches between an all-Indian 11 and an all-Chinese 11 at the Chinese Cricket Club, now owned by Melbourne, all Jamaicans applauded it. However, when two black Jamaicans, which included this writer, asked the captain of the East Indian 11, who was a former Boys Town player, if an all-African 11 of black Jamaicans could play the winner of his match against the Chinese 11, his answer was, boy, we don't want to get into the race thing. I think everybody got that. We don't want to get mixed up in this race business, but they're having a match, Indians versus China, but when Africans come in, it now becomes race. So Tosh's assertion of an African identity for black Jamaicans immediately contests the racist devaluation of continental Africa in Jamaica. And having established African as a racial category, Tosh proceeds to affirm a quintessential African racial identity that is not exclusively bound to the particular geographical space of national origin. Now, mind your nationality, you have got the identity of an African. Global African identity, therefore, manifests itself in a variety of local settings. But somewhat paradoxically, Tosh both asserts the convergence of race and place and contests that very identification. All black people come from Africa, so to be black is to be African. But to be African is not necessarily a function of having been physically born on the continent. Africa is a continent of consciousness. And so white people born on the continent are not African in the racialized sense of the word. Tanzanian-born literary critic Jane Bryce, who teaches at the Barbados campus of the University of the West Indies, articulates very poignantly the sense of dislocation of the white person born in Africa and essentially alienated from the place. In her essay, White Child, Black Nation, she confesses her distance from the liberating discourse of black nationalism in the former British colony. I did not know what Uhuru was, but I knew it was a great occasion which had stirred up the whole country. As time went by, I understood it better. It meant change, not always for the better. Our much-loved ayah, Martha Nairobi, who had cared for each of us from infancy, joined TANU, the new political party, and started attending night school. We were all shocked when one day she informed my mother that she did not want to work for white people anymore and left us. I felt it as a personal betrayal, though if I had thought back, I might have been less surprised. Long before Uhuru or politics or night school, Martha had roundly rebuked me for refusing to do something she had told me to do because I said, "I am white and you are black." Her retort, "God made white and black," must have entered my subconscious and stayed there, one tiny seed of resistance to the all-pervading assumption of superiority in which I was immersed. This sense of complacent and complicit alienation from the land and people that many whites born in Africa enjoy contrasts markedly with the atavistic sense of home that compels Africans born outside the continent to valorize repatriation of the mind, especially when the body does not have the economic resources to follow the spirit. At a free concert put on by the Jamaican Boba Dread Rastafari DJ Sizzler in his home community of Augustown, one of the performers on the bill, Sandakan I think it was, used a brilliant metaphor to describe the sense of primal connection that scattered Africans feel for the continent. Africa is an emotional magnet. It's a brilliant metaphor. So Tosh invokes the magnetic concept of the African diaspora, or scattered Africa, as the Trinidadian Garvey scholar Tony Martin would prefer. In the essay Garvey and Scattered Africa, published in Global Dimensions of the African Diaspora, Martin interrogates the word diaspora and the politics of mimicry it embeds. He says, "Before I begin my discussion of Garvey, I would like to make a simple suggestion that the term diaspora be deleted from our vocabulary, because the term African diaspora reinforces a tendency among those of us writing our history to see the history of African people always in terms of parallels in white history. On this model of thinking, Garvey is called a black Zionist, George Padmore a black revolutionary, and Du Bois a black titan. There are parallels between black history and white history, of course, but it is unfortunate that blacks do not see our history primarily in its own right. We always seem to be looking for parallels in the experience of other peoples to shape our history. In the old days, other peoples told us we had no history at all. Now they acknowledge our history, but only in terms of other people's history. So we should do away with the expression African diaspora because we're not Jews. Let us use some other terminology. Let us speak of the African dispersion, or uprooted Africa, as somebody suggested, or scattered Africa. Now, uprooted Africa for me signifies catastrophe, the toppling of an ancient tree of life that sheltered countless generations on the continent. And indeed, the wrenching Middle Passage that dislocated so many of us Africans is a genocidal disaster of oceanic proportions. I prefer the metaphor scattered Africa, which not only denotes disruption and dislocation, but also connotes regeneration. The act of scattering encodes an agricultural image of germination, seeds sown to the wind that will eventually bear fruit. The scattering of African peoples across the globe engenders cultural cross-fertilization. Hybrid strains and hardy new varieties of Africanness emerge out of the sowing. Tosh establishes ever-widening